On a cold night, a millionaire leaves his company late when he sees a little beggar girl trembling on the sidewalk. "Sir, the boogeyman hurts me every night," she whispers with terror in her eyes. The millionaire, who normally would never stop to listen to someone in this situation, feels something and returns, asking her to explain what the boogeyman does to her. The girl, afraid to sleep alone again, tells the man something so shocking that he immediately calls the police. But when the officers arrive, something horrible happens that he could never have expected. The clock on the Mercedes dashboard read 11:43 p.m. when Edward Miller finally shut down his computer. Another 16-hour workday came to an end, leaving him with that familiar hollow feeling that had accompanied him for years. At Tihu, 40 years old, he had built a business empire, but his personal life was a barren desert where no genuine emotion could flourish. The office on the 30th floor offered a privileged view of the slumbering city, but Edward rarely looked out. The window, numbers, spreadsheets, and contracts consumed his entire attention, a wall of responsibilities he had erected to avoid confronting the loneliness that gnawed at him from within. His secretary had left hours ago, as had all the employees, leaving him alone, with the silence that both terrified and comforted him. He adjusted his expensive tie with mechanical movements and picked up the Italian wool coat hanging on his chair. Winter was especially harsh that year, with biting winds that seemed to cut right through him. Edward, however, had long since lost the ability to feel the cold outside. The ice he carried within his chest was far more intense and permanent. The elevator descended in silence, reflecting his image in the mirror. Perfectly coiffed graying hair, impeccable suit, an erect posture that exuded authority. It was the image of absolute success, but behind his brown eyes lay a profound weariness that all the money in the world couldn't cure. His hands, always busy with important documents, trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from an emotional exhaustion that had accumulated over decades. The underground parking garage was empty, except for his car and that of the night janitor. Edward greeted the man with a cold nod, as he always did, never asking his name or showing any interest in his life. Relationships were unnecessary complications in his carefully organized existence, where every minute had its purpose and every emotion was strictly controlled. The Mercedes glided through the deserted streets, its engine softly purring. Edward drove on autopilot, his mind already planning the next day's activities. 3 important meetings, 2 contracts to review, and a conference call with Japanese investors. The routine reassured him, offering the illusion of absolute control over his life, even when he felt he was merely surviving. It was then that he saw a small figure huddled on the sidewalk. Edward instinctively hit the brakes, his heart pounding without apparent reason. A child was sitting on the icy pavement, leaning against the wall of a closed commercial building. Even from inside the heated car, he could see she was trembling violently, her thin arms wrapped around her knees in a desperate attempt to keep warm. For a moment, he considered accelerating and driving on. Homeless children were a social problem that didn't concern him, an unpleasant reality he preferred to ignore. His life functioned perfectly when he kept his distance from other people's problems, focused only on his business objectives and his chosen solitude. But something in the girl's eyes made him hesitate. She was looking directly at him through the windshield, and there was something in that gaze that deeply unsettled him. It wasn't just fear or hunger, it was a pure, genuine terror that seemed to pierce through all the barriers he had built around his heart. Her tiny, dirty hands clutched a piece of cardboard that served as a makeshift blanket, and her lips, blue with cold, moved as if she were whispering a desperate prayer. Edward turned off the engine with trembling hands, not understanding why he was doing it. The girl couldn't have been more than 6, with tangled brown hair and clothes that seemed to have been too big once, but now hung loosely on her thin frame. When he opened the car door, the cold wind hit him like a slap, but it was the child's faint voice that truly made him shiver. "Sir," she called out, her voice hoarse from crying, "the boogeyman hurts me every night." Edward froze for a few seconds, processing the girl's words. Boogeyman, an expression that should have sounded childish and innocent, but which came from those trembling lips laden with a fear so real it made his stomach churn. He slowly crouched down, trying to get to her level, a gesture he hadn't made in decades, not since he'd stopped being the uncle figure to acquaintances' children who had gradually drifted out of his life. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended, surprising himself with his own gentleness. The girl stared at him with those enormous, frightened eyes, as if assessing whether she could trust him. There was a premature wisdom in that gaze, the kind of knowledge no child should possess. "Sophia," she whispered, wiping her nose with the back of her dirty hand. "But everyone calls me So-So. The boogeyman calls me that too when he comes looking for me." Her voice broke on the last phrase, and Edward felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he had long buried under layers of ambition and indifference. Edward looked around, noting the street was completely deserted. There was no one to witness that strange conversation. No one to judge the successful businessman talking to a homeless girl in the middle of the night. For the first time in years, he didn't care about appearances or what others might think. "Sophia," he repeated the name, savoring its simplicity. "What exactly does this boogeyman do to you?" The question came out more direct than he intended, but there was a growing urgency in his chest that he couldn't explain. Something about the situation was affecting him in a way that defied all his business logic. The girl hugged her knees tighter, swaying her body back and forth in a movement that evidenced deep trauma. "He hits me," she said, with devastating simplicity, "pushes me against the wall and says if I tell anyone, he'll hurt me even worse. He says he always knows where I sleep, that he's always watching me." Edward felt bile rise in his throat. That wasn't the fantasy of a scared child. There were too many specific details, a fear too real to be a product of imagination. The purple marks he now noticed on the girl's thin arms confirmed her words were no invention. "Where are your parents, Sophia?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer from the child's condition. She lowered her head, her hair falling like a curtain over her dirty face. "I don't have any. The lady who took care of me died last year, and since then I've been on the streets. I sleep in different places every night because the boogeyman always finds me." She looked up again, and Edward saw tears tracing clean paths down her dirty cheeks. "I'm so scared to sleep, Mr. Edward. So scared." Edward stood up abruptly, his legs wobbly. His analytical mind tried to process the situation. An abandoned child being preyed upon by a predator. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to call the police and distance himself from a problem that wasn't his. But a deeper voice, one that had been silenced for years, whispered something different. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket with trembling hands and dialed 911. As he waited for someone to answer, he watched Sophia shrink even further, as if the mere act of calling for help could bring terrible consequences. When someone finally answered, Edward explained the situation objectively and clearly, providing the exact address. "A patrol car will be there in 15 minutes, the dispatcher said in a professional tone. Edward hung up and looked at Sophia, who watched him with a mixture of hope and terror. "It's going to be okay," he said, words that sounded strange coming from his mouth. How long had it been since he'd offered comfort to anyone? How long since he genuinely cared about another person's suffering? The girl nodded weakly, but he could see she didn't fully believe his words. The 15 minutes dragged on like hours. Edward remained standing beside the car, while Sophia remained huddled on the sidewalk. He wanted to sit beside her, to offer some physical comfort, but decades of emotional isolation prevented him from acting naturally. Instead, he took off his coat and held it out to her. "Wear this," he said softly. "It's freezing out here." Sophia accepted the coat with reverence, as if it were the most precious gift she had ever received. The fine fabric swallowed her whole, but Edward could see the relief in her shoulders as the warmth finally reached her. When the blue and red lights of the patrol car finally appeared at the end of the street, Edward felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Soon, that responsibility would leave his hands and return to the proper authorities. His life could return to normal, to the predictable safety of his solitary routine. But as the officer stepped out of the patrol car and walked towards them, something in the man's dismissive smirk made Edward realize that this story was only just beginning. Sergeant Harris stepped out of the patrol car with the weary nonchalance of someone who had already handled dozens of similar calls that night. He was a corpulent man, with a graying mustache and small eyes that seemed to appraise people as if they were goods on a shelf. His uniform was rumpled and there was a coffee stain on his shirt, details Edward immediately noticed with his eye trained to spot sloppiness. "Good evening," the officer said, addressing Edward exclusively and completely ignoring Sophia, who shrank further into the oversized coat. "You're the one who called in a minor in distress." Edward nodded, feeling a stab of irritation at the way the man referred to the girl as if she were an object. "Yes, officer. This child reported that she's being stalked and assaulted by an adult. She has visible marks of violence and is clearly terrified." Sergeant Harris let out a short chuckle that sent a chill down Edward's spine. It was the kind of laugh that denoted deep cynicism and complete indifference to another's suffering. The officer crouched down in front of Sophia, but not with the gentleness Edward had shown. It was a mechanical, perfunctory gesture. "So, little lady," he said, his voice attempting to sound paternal, but carrying a thinly veiled tone of mockery. "What's the story this time? Some mean old adult chasing you around?" The sarcasm was evident, and Edward watched Sophia shrink further, like a flower closing its petals before a storm. He hurts me," Sophia whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "The boogeyman comes every night and—" She couldn't finish the sentence, starting to cry silently. The tears left clean trails on her dirty cheeks, a painful contrast that broke Edward's heart. Sergeant Harris stood up with an exaggerated sigh and turned back to Edward with an expression that mixed pity and irritation. "Look, sir," he said, using the respectful address only because he'd noticed from the car and clothes that he was dealing with someone important. "Do you really believe a street kid? They'll make up anything to get money or shelter." Edward felt his blood boil. He hadn't felt such intense, pure anger in years. All his corporate coolness vanished before the casual cruelty of that man who was supposed to protect the most vulnerable. "Officer," he said, his voice controlled but heavy with authority, "this child has visible marks of assault. She reported specific details about the abuse. How can you simply ignore that?" The officer shrugged, pulling a small notepad from his shirt pocket. "Look, sir, I've been in this line of work for 15 years. I've seen it all. These kids are smart. They know exactly what to say to elicit pity. She probably got hurt playing or fighting with other street kids." Edward looked at Sophia, who had stopped crying but kept her eyes fixed on the ground, as if she already expected exactly that reaction. There was a resignation in her posture that was more painful than her tears. The acceptance of a child who had already learned that the adult world rarely cared about her suffering. "Are you going to investigate or not?" Edward asked, his voice adopting the icy tone he used in his toughest negotiations. Sergeant Harris stared at him for a moment, weighing whether it was worth confronting this obviously influential man. "I'll file a report," he finally said, scribbling a few lines in his notepad. "But frankly, sir, you're wasting your time. These kids appear and disappear from the streets like ghosts. Tomorrow she won't even be here." Edward watched the officer, right carelessly, without asking a single specific question about the alleged assailant, without requesting descriptions, without showing any real interest in investigating. It was a grotesque theater, a perfunctory charade that merely served to fulfill bureaucratic procedures. "There," the sergeant said, tearing a sheet from the notepad and handing it to Edward. "Here's the report number. If anything happens, you can call and reference this number." He put away his notepad and headed back to the patrol car, but stopped when Edward called out to him. "What about her? What's going to happen to the girl?" The officer turned back with an expression that mixed surprise and impatience. "What do you mean, sir? She goes back to where she was. It's not a crime to be on the streets, and we don't have shelters available at this hour of the night." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "But she said she's being stalked. How can you just abandon her here?" "Sir," the sergeant said condescendingly, "if we picked up every kid who complained about the boogeyman, we wouldn't have room anywhere. She'll be fine. These kids are resilient." The patrol car drove off, leaving a cloud of exhaust and the echo of a distant horn. Edward stood on the sidewalk, looking at the crumpled paper in his hands. A report that was absolutely worthless. An empty promise of protection that would never come. Sophia remained huddled on the ground, still wearing his coat, but now she was crying again. A silent, desperate cry from someone who had just seen it confirmed that she was completely alone in the world. Edward realized he had reached a point of no return in his perfectly organized life. Edward remained motionless for long minutes, the police report trembling in his hands in the cold pre-dawn wind. Sophia had stopped crying, but her occasional sniffles cut through the silence like daggers in his conscience. He tried to rationalize the situation, to find a logical way out that didn't involve personal complication. He could leave some money with her and drive away. He could call charity organizations in the morning. He could simply get back in his car and drive home, leaving that responsibility to the proper authorities. All these options flashed through his mind as practical, sensible solutions for a man who had always prioritized efficiency over emotion. But when he looked at Sophia again, he saw she was trying to stand up with difficulty, limping slightly. Only then did Edward notice the girl had taken off one of her sneakers, a torn, oversized shoe, and that there was blood on her white sock, now stained red. "You're hurt," he said, crouching beside her again. Sophia tried to hide her foot, clearly embarrassed, but Edward had already seen. "Let me see." With a gentleness that surprised him, he helped Sophia sit on the curb and examined her injured foot. There was a deep cut on the sole of her foot, likely caused by broken glass or sharp metal on the streets. The wound was dirty and starting to get infected, a sight that made Edward feel nauseous. "This needs to be cleaned and treated," he said, more to himself than to her. Sophia looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear, as if she couldn't believe someone was caring about her pain. "I can't go to the hospital," she whispered. "They'll take me to some place and the boogeyman will find me again. He always finds me." Edward felt his chest tighten. The cold logic that had always governed his decisions began to crumble before the raw reality of the situation. He couldn't abandon a wounded, terrified child on the street, even if it meant complicating his orderly life in ways he couldn't even imagine. "Sophia," he said in a firmer voice, "where did you say the boogeyman usually finds you?" "Everywhere," she replied, her eyes filling with tears again. "When I sleep in the park, he shows up. When I stay under the bridge, he finds me. It's like he always knows where I'm going to be." Her voice broke. "I don't know where to go anymore, Mr. Edward." "I'm so scared." Edward looked around the deserted street, calculating risks and possibilities. His mansion was only 15 minutes away, in a gated community with strict security. It would be a temporarily safe place while he thought of a definitive solution. The idea of taking a stranger to his home went against all his self-preservation instincts, but something stronger was speaking within him. "Sophia, would you trust me for one night?" he asked, surprising himself with his own words. "I have a secure house with high gates and guards. The boogeyman couldn't get in there." Sophia's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and disbelief shining in them. You'd let me stay at your house?" Her voice was almost inaudible, as if asking the question aloud could break the spell of that impossible moment. Edward nodded, feeling as if he were jumping off a cliff without knowing where he would land. "Just for one night," he said, both to her and to himself. "Until I can find a better solution, an appropriate place for you to stay." Sophia tried to stand up again, but moaned in pain when she put her injured foot on the ground. Without thinking twice, Edward picked her up, surprised by how light she was. The girl was skin and bones, a child who clearly hadn't received adequate nourishment for a long time. "It's okay," he murmured, carrying her to the car. "We'll take care of that foot, and you'll be able to sleep without fear for one night." As he settled Sophia into the back seat of the Mercedes, Edward tried to process what he was doing. For 40 years, he had led a meticulously planned life, where every decision was based on careful cost-benefit analyses. Now he was taking an unknown girl to his home, based purely on an emotional impulse he couldn't comprehend. Sophia huddled in the leather seat, still wrapped in his coat, looking out the window with an expression of wonder. "Is your house far from here, Mr. Edward?" she asked in a small voice. "Not too far," Edward replied, turning the heater to full blast. "And you can call me Edward. What's your last name, Sophia?" "I don't know," she said simply. "The lady always just called me Sophia. And when she died, no one told me my full name." Edward felt a knot in his throat. A child who didn't know her own last name, who had no documents, who didn't officially exist to the world. The dimension of Sophia's vulnerability hit him like an avalanche, making him realize that one night in his home would only be the beginning of a much larger problem. As he drove through the empty streets towards the gated community, Edward looked in the rearview mirror and saw Sophia struggling to keep her eyes open, exhausted but still alert. Like a wounded animal, unable to fully relax, even when it finally finds shelter. He was about to discover that some decisions change our lives in irreversible ways. The electronic gate of the ridge at Stonebrook opened smoothly, revealing impeccably manicured gardens and mansions illuminated by a discreet yellow light. Edward waved to the security guard, who greeted him with habitual respect, but noticed how the man's brow furrowed as he glimpsed the small passenger in the back seat. Sophia was awake, pressed against the window, observing with wide eyes that world that seemed to have stepped out of a fairy tale. The enormous houses, the perfect gardens, the clean streets, everything was so different from the cruel reality of the sidewalks where she slept that she could barely believe it was real. "Is this where you live?" she asked, her voice full of admiration as Edward stopped in front of a two-story mansion with large glass windows and a stone facade that exuded discreet elegance. "Yes," Edward replied, feeling a strange shame at the ostentation of his house, when contrasted with the girl's absolute poverty. For the first time in years, he saw his property through the eyes of someone who had nothing, and the disparity deeply bothered him. Edward helped Sophia out of the car, carrying her again when she tried to put weight on her injured foot. The girl clung to him tightly, as if she feared that moment was just a dream, from which she would soon wake up to the coldness of the street. The entrance to the house was wide and lit by a crystal chandelier that made tiny rainbows dance on the walls. Sophia looked at everything with an almost religious reverence, delicately touching the polished surfaces as if they were made of sacred material. "First, let's take care of your foot," Edward said, leading her to the powder room near the entrance. He hadn't used that space in years. His routine was so predictable that he rarely needed the formal rooms of the house. Carefully, he helped Sophia sit on the marble countertop and went to get a first aid kit he kept in the cabinet. His hands, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, trembled slightly as he cleaned the girl's wound with warm water and antiseptic. Sophia bit her lip to keep from crying when the liquid stung the wound, but her eyes filled with tears. "It hurts," she whispered, clutching the edge of the countertop. "I know, little one," Edward said softly, a tender word that came naturally from his lips for the first time in decades. "But it needs to be cleaned so it doesn't get infected. You've been very brave, enduring this pain until now." As he applied the dressing, Edward observed the other marks on Sophia's thin body. Besides the bruises on her arms he'd noticed on the street, there were scratches on her legs and a yellowish bruise on her shoulder that indicated an older assault. Each mark was painful evidence that the girl's story was real, that someone was indeed systematically hurting her. "There," he said, finishing the dressing. "Now you need to eat something and rest." Edward paused, realizing he had no idea how to care for a child. His refrigerator was practically empty. He ate at the office or ordered takeout. His house was a place to sleep, not to live. He led Sophia to the kitchen, a spacious and modern room that was impeccably clean because it was rarely used. The girl looked at the stainless steel appliances as if they were spaceships, touching the double-door refrigerator with admiration. "Are you hungry?" he asked, opening the refrigerator and confirming his suspicions. Only water, some fruit. That was starting to go bad, and 3-day-old Chinese takeout. Sophia nodded shyly. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning," she admitted, shame evident in her voice. "A lady gave me some bread, but the boogeyman showed up and I had to run, left everything behind." Edward felt his heart clench again. He searched the cupboards and found a can of vegetable soup he didn't even remember buying. As he heated the soup in the microwave, one of the few appliances he knew how to use, he watched Sophia explore the kitchen carefully, as if she were afraid of breaking something. "Sit here," he said, indicating a tall stool at the central island. Sophia climbed up with difficulty, still favoring her injured foot, and waited patiently while he prepared the makeshift meal. When he placed the steaming bowl in front of her, Sophia looked at the soup as if it were a royal feast. Her small hands held the spoon with exaggerated delicacy, and she ate slowly, savoring every spoonful as if it were her last. "Is it good?" Edward asked, sitting beside her on an identical stool. It was the first time in years he had shared a meal with anyone, even if it was just canned soup with a child he'd found on the street. "It's delicious," Sophia replied with complete sincerity, a small but genuine smile lighting up her face for the first time since they met. "Thank you, Mr. Edward. You're the kindest person I've ever met." Edward swallowed hard, not knowing how to respond to such gratitude for such a simple gesture. He was beginning to realize how disconnected he had become from basic humanity, how insensitive he had grown to people's most fundamental needs. After the soup, Sophia yawned repeatedly, exhaustion finally overcoming the adrenaline of fear. Edward realized he needed to find a place for her to sleep, but all the guest rooms had been closed for years, with linens stored away and furniture covered. "You can sleep on the living room sofa tonight," he said, leading her to the main living area. It was a soft, white leather sofa, larger than many beds, but Sophia looked at it with hesitation. "Can I really sleep here?" she asked, as if she couldn't believe her luck. And the boogeyman won't be able to get in." Edward activated the house's security system, showing Sophia the green lights that indicated all doors and windows were secured. See these lights? They mean the house is completely safe. No one can get in without my knowing. For the first time since he'd found her, Edward saw Sophia completely relax. Her little shoulders dropped, the tension left her face, and she lay down on the sofa with a deep sigh of relief. "Good night, Mr. Edward," she whispered, already half asleep. "Thank you for saving me." Edward stood in the living room, watching the girl fall asleep under the throw blanket he had brought from his bedroom. For the first time in 20 years, his silent house didn't feel like a mausoleum, but a home where someone could finally rest in peace. Edward woke at 5:30 in the morning, as he always had for 20 years, but for the first time, his morning routine was interrupted by a strange sound coming from the living room. They were muffled sobs, almost imperceptible, but they cut through the silence of the house like an emergency siren. He rushed downstairs, still in his pajamas, and found Sophia awake on the sofa, curled into a ball and trembling violently. Her eyes were wide with terror, fixed on the living room window, as if she was seeing something horrifying on the other side of the glass. "Sophia, what's wrong?" he asked, approaching slowly so as not to startle her further. The girl turned to him with tears streaming down her face, and Edward realized she had wet the sofa, an accident that clearly mortified her. I had a nightmare," she whispered, her voice choked. "I dreamed the boogeyman had broken the window and was taking me away. I'm sorry I soiled your beautiful couch, Mr. Edward. I didn't mean to, I swear." Edward felt his heart clench at the girl's despair over a perfectly understandable accident for a traumatized child. He sat beside her on the sofa, disregarding the dampness, and for the first time in decades offered a spontaneous embrace. "It's no problem at all, Sophia," he said softly, feeling how she clung to him with desperate strength. "It was just a nightmare. You're safe here, I promise. And the couch can be cleaned, don't worry about it." As he comforted Sophia, Edward realized something that deeply disturbed him. He was enjoying being needed by someone. Decades of self-imposed solitude had created a void in his life that he hadn't even realized existed until that moment, when a scared child needed his comfort. "How about we get you a bath, and then I'll make breakfast," he suggested, trying to bring some normalcy to the situation. Sophia looked at him with wide eyes, as if the idea of a warm bath was an unimaginable luxury. Edward led her to the ground floor bathroom, a spacious room with a jacuzzi tub he never used. As the tub filled with warm water, he looked for clean and towels and realized he didn't have any clothes suitable for a child. "I'll lend you one of my t-shirts to wear after your bath," he said, noting how Sophia touched the water with reverence, testing the temperature as if she couldn't believe it was real. "Can I really take a bath in the tub?" she asked, her voice full of admiration. "I've never taken a bath in a tub before, only in the showers at the community center sometimes, when the staff let us." Edward felt a knot in his throat as he realized how many basic childhood experiences Sophia had missed out on. "Of course you can. Use all the soap you want, all the warm water you need. I'll make breakfast while you're in there." In the kitchen, Edward faced another challenge. He couldn't cook. His diet consisted of executive lunches at work and food delivery at home. He opened all the cupboards, finding only some expired cereal and a box of crackers he didn't even remember buying. He decided to call a grocery delivery service, ordering basic breakfast items: bread, fruit, milk, eggs, yogurt. When questioned about the urgency of the delivery, it was only 6:30 in the morning, Edward explained it was a family emergency, surprising himself at how naturally he referred to Sophia that way. While waiting for the delivery, he went upstairs to check on Sophia. He found her still in the tub, playing with soap bubbles with a genuine smile that completely transformed her face. It was the first time he'd seen her truly happy, and the sight touched Edward in a way he couldn't explain. "Mr. Edward," she called out when she saw him at the door. "Look how many bubbles! It's like a foam castle." Her childlike joy was contagious, and Edward found himself smiling. A real smile, not the perfunctory one he used in business meetings. "Very nice," he said, sitting on the bathroom floor to talk with her. "Ah, you feeling better?" Sophia nodded vigorously. "Much better. The warm water made my body stop hurting, and the soap smells just like flowers." She stopped playing and looked at him seriously. "Mr. Edward, why are you being so good to me? No one's ever been like this." The question caught him off guard. Edward didn't know how to answer because he didn't fully understand his own motivations. "Because you need help," he finally said, "and I can help." "But I'm not your family," Sophia continued with the simple, devastating logic of children. "And I don't have money to pay you. Why did you bring me to your beautiful house?" Edward was silent for a few moments, processing the question. After decades living only to accumulate wealth and power, a 6-year-old child was questioning the foundations of his life values. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "we do the right thing simply because it's right, not because we expect something in return. You reminded me of that last night." Sophia smiled, apparently satisfied with the answer, and returned to playing with the bubbles. Edward remained there, watching a child discover joy in simple things, and realizing he was learning about happiness from someone who had lost almost everything. When the food arrived, Edward helped Sophia get dressed in one of his t-shirts, which fit her like a dress, and they went down to the kitchen together. Preparing breakfast became a shared adventure, with Sophia guiding him on how to crack eggs without getting shell pieces in the pan. "You've never cooked before?" she asked, genuinely curious as she watched him struggle with an omelette that looked more like misshapen scrambled eggs. "I never had the need," Edward admitted, realizing how strange his answer sounded even to him. An entire life without ever preparing a simple meal for himself or for someone special. "The lady taught me to cook some things," Sophia said, taking control of the pan with a competence that surprised Edward. "She used to say everyone needs to know how to cook so they don't starve." Watching Sophia cook with confident movements despite her young age, Edward realized that this child had been forced to grow up too fast, taking on responsibilities no child should have. As they ate the omelette Sophia had salvaged together, Edward realized that a single night had profoundly changed his perspective on everything he considered important in life. Edward was getting ready to leave for work when Sophia grabbed his hand tightly, her eyes full of panic. It was Monday, and after an entire weekend in the safety of the mansion, the girl had begun to relax, but the idea of being alone terrified her again. "Are you coming back?" she asked in a small voice, clinging to his leg as if he were a lifeline. "The boogeyman won't show up while you're gone, will he?" Edward crouched down to her level, realizing he hadn't considered what he would do with Sophia during the day. For the past 3 days, he had improvised, canceling some meetings and working from home, but he couldn't maintain that routine indefinitely without raising suspicions. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "And the house will be locked with the alarm on. You'll be safe here." But even as he said it, Edward could see that Sophia wasn't convinced. The trauma had taught her that safety was always temporary. "What if I come with you?" Sophia suggested timidly. "I can stay quiet in your office, I promise. I won't bother anyone." Edward considered the proposal for a moment. Taking a child to the office would create 1,000 questions he didn't know how to answer, but the alternative of leaving her alone and terrified seemed worse. "All right," he finally said, "but you'll have to stay in my office while I work." The drive to the office was a revelation for Sophia. Sitting in the front seat for the first time, she watched the city wake up with infinite curiosity, asking questions about everything she saw. Edward, accustomed to making the commute on autopilot, began to see the city through her eyes. "Why are those people sleeping on the street if it's cold?" she asked when they passed a group of homeless people. The simple question hit Edward like a punch, forcing him to confront a reality he had always conveniently ignored. At the office, Edward caused a stir by appearing accompanied by a child. His secretary, Marcia, an efficient woman in her 50s, who had worked with him for a decade, nearly choked on her coffee when she saw them enter together. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said, trying to maintain professional composure while looking curiously at Sophia. "This is Sophia," Edward said simply. "She'll be staying in my office today. Please cancel the 10 o'clock meeting and reschedule it for tomorrow." Marcia nodded, but Edward could see the confusion in her eyes. In 10 years of working together, he had never brought anyone personal to the office, much less a child. His private life was a complete mystery to all the employees. In the office, Edward set Sophia up in an armchair with some books he asked Marcia to buy from the lobby bookstore. The girl behaved exemplarily, drawing and reading quietly while he worked. But Edward realized he couldn't concentrate as he used. 2. He constantly found himself looking at her, checking if she was all right. It was during the afternoon that everything changed. Edward was on a video conference call with Japanese investors when he heard Sophia gasp loudly. He looked at her and saw that the girl was pale, trembling, and pointing at the glass window that overlooked the company corridor. "It's him," Sophia whispered, her voice laden with absolute terror. "It's the Boogeyman. He found me." Edward followed Sophia's gaze and felt his blood run cold. On the other side of the glass, standing in the corridor and looking directly at them, was Richard Vance, his partner of 15 years, and the company's vice president. The man who had helped build that business empire, who knew all his professional secrets, who had dined at his home dozens of times. Richard was smiling, not the professional smile he used in meetings, but something far more sinister. When he realized Edward had seen him, he made a subtle gesture with his hand, as if waving to Sophia, and then pointed to his watch, as if setting an appointment. Edward abruptly ended the video conference, ignoring the confused protests of the Japanese investors. His world had just completely collapsed. The man he trusted professionally, who had access to all aspects of his business life, was the monster who was stalking Sophia. "Mr. Edward," Sophia cried softly, "I told you he always found me. He works here." Edward rose from his chair, his legs shaky, trying to process the devastating implications of that revelation. Richard not only knew Sophia, he had discovered where she was hiding. Even worse, as a partner in the company, he had access to information about Edward's personal life, including his home address. "Sophia," he said, his voice controlled but his heart pounding, "I need you to tell me everything about the Boogeyman, every detail you can remember." The girl shrank into the armchair but began to speak in a trembling voice. "He has a small scar on his right hand. He talks softly when he hurts me, and he always smells like expensive cigars. He once said he knew important people and that if I told anyone, no one would believe me." Every detail corresponded perfectly to Richard. The scar from the surgery he'd had the previous year, the habit of speaking softly during tense negotiations, the Cuban cigars he smoked. Edward felt nauseous, realizing how many times he had shaken that man's hand, how many times he had trusted him with important decisions. At that moment, the office door opened, and Richard entered without knocking, as he always did. His smile was cordial, but his eyes held a dangerous glint Edward never noticed before. "Edward, my friend," Richard said in the soft voice Sophia had described, What a pleasant surprise to find you two here. I didn't know you had family interests." Sophia hid behind Edward's armchair, trembling violently, and Richard watched her with ill-disguised satisfaction. Edward felt a primal fury rise in his chest, the protective instinct he'd never known he possessed. "Richard," he said in a cold voice, "I think you'd better leave my office. Now." Richard chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down Edward's spine. Of course, but perhaps we should talk privately later. I'm sure we have much to discuss about family responsibilities." The veiled threat was clear. Richard knew Edward had discovered his secret, but he also knew he held power over him. As a partner in the company, he could destroy everything Edward had built. When Richard left, Edward realized he had reached the most crucial moment of his life, choosing between preserving his business empire or protecting an innocent child. And for the first time in 40 years, the choice was absurdly easy. Edward spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of shock, feigning normalcy while his mind worked feverishly to process the new reality. Sophia remained glued to him, refusing to be alone even for a minute, and he didn't have the heart to force her away. When they finally left the office at 6 in the evening, Edward drove in silence, constantly checking the rearview mirror to ensure they weren't being followed. Sophia noticed his tension and shrank into the seat, as if she feared her presence was the cause of all the problems. "Mr. Edward," she said in a small voice when they arrived at the mansion, "I can leave if you want. I didn't want the boogeyman to know where you work. Now he's going to hurt you too." Edward stopped the car in the garage and turned to look at her, seeing tears streaming down the girl's cheeks. "Sophia, listen closely. None of this is your fault. You did nothing wrong. The only culprit here is the man who hurt you." But even as he comforted Sophia, Edward felt the weight of the situation pressing on his shoulders. Richard wasn't just any predator. He was his partner, knew all his business secrets, had access to his accounts, knew where he lived. The situation was infinitely more complex than he had imagined. Inside the house, Edward served dinner in silence, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He could try to gather evidence against Richard, but how? Whose word would be taken? A homeless child's. Against a respected businessman's? He could confront him directly, but that would put Sophia in even greater danger. "You're not eating," Sophia observed, pushing a piece of chicken around on her plate. "Are you worried about me?" Edward looked at the girl, thin, frightened, yet displaying a devastating maturity by worrying about him when she was the one in danger. "I'm thinking about how to keep you safe," he admitted. Sophia nodded gravely. "The boogeyman is very clever. He always manages to find me, no matter where I hide. And now he knows you're helping me." She stopped eating and stared at him with eyes too serious for a child. "He's going to try to hurt you to hurt me more." The simplicity with which Sophia analyzed the situation hit Edward like a lightning bolt. She understood the dynamics of power and manipulation better than many adults because she had personally lived the consequences of human cruelty. That night, Edward settled Sophia into the guest room he had specially prepared for her, but noticed the girl couldn't relax as she had on previous days. She started at every noise, repeatedly asked if the doors were locked, constantly checked the windows. "He's going to come here tonight," she said with absolute certainty when Edward came to say goodnight. "He doesn't like it when kids are away from him for too long. He gets angry." Edward sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Sophia, can you tell me more about how he found you before? How did he know where you were?" Sophia huddled under the covers, but began to speak. "Sometimes I'd see him in his car, driving slowly down the streets where I slept. Other times he'd show up in the places where I asked for food. Once he said he had friends who would tell him when they saw me." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. Richard had a network of informants, people who would tell him about Sophia's movements. This explained how he consistently managed to find her and suggested a level of organization and premeditation that made the situation even more sinister. Did he do this to other children too? Edward asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sophia nodded sadly. There was an older girl, Julia. She tried to protect me once, but then she disappeared. The boogeyman said she'd gone, away to a far-off place where disobedient children go. The fear in Sophia's voice as she recounted this made Edward realize that Richard had probably threatened other children to silence them. After Sophia finally fell asleep, Edward went down to his home office and spent hours searching online for information about Richard Vance. He searched for any mention of scandals, lawsuits, suspicious behavior. He found only praise, articles about his philanthropy, his involvement in charitable organizations, awards for social responsibility. The irony was nauseating. The man who tortured vulnerable children was publicly recognized as a children's rights advocate. At 2 a.m, the house's security system sent a soft alert to Edward's phone. Someone was testing the front gate. The security cameras showed a shadowy figure circling the perimeter of the property, checking for possible entry points. Edward rushed up to Sophia's room and found her awake, sitting in bed with her knees hugged to her chest. "He's here," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with terror in the darkness. "I told you he'd come." Through the bedroom window, Edward could see a silhouette standing across the street, watching the house. Even in the darkness, he recognized Richard's posture. The man was sending a clear message. No matter how many security measures Edward took, he would always find a way to get to Sophia. "Mr. Edward," Sophia called in a weak voice, "maybe I should leave. He's never going to stop looking for me, and now he knows you're helping me. I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Edward looked at the courageous girl who was willing to sacrifice herself to protect him, and realized he had reached the point where he needed to make a definitive decision. He could no longer pretend this was temporary, that he would find an easy solution that cost him nothing. "Sophia," he said with a determination that surprised even himself, "I promise you'll never have to run again, no matter what I have to do." It was a promise that would change their lives forever, and Edward was ready to pay any price to keep it. The next morning, Edward made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He missed work for the first time in 15 years. He called Marcia, inventing an excuse about urgent family matters, and spent the day devising a plan to expose Richard once and for all. Sophia watched him from the kitchen table, eating cereal in silence, but Edward could feel the weight of her worried gaze. The girl had learned to read adult emotions as a matter of survival, and she knew something important was being decided. "Mr. Edward," she finally said, "you're planning something dangerous, aren't you?" Her voice carried a heartbreaking wisdom, a 6-year-old child who instinctively understood the risks adults took for her sake. Edward stopped writing in his notepad and looked at her. "Sophia, I need to ask you a very important question, and I need you to be completely honest with me, okay?" Sophia nodded gravely, setting her spoon aside and giving him her full attention. "Would you be brave enough to help stop the boogeyman from hurting other children like you?" Edward knew he was asking a lot of a traumatized girl, but he also knew that Sophia was stronger and more resilient than she appeared. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but her voice came out firm. "If it means he'll never hurt anyone again, I'll do anything. Even go back near him one last time." The girl's courage deeply impressed Edward. "No, Sophia, you're never going to be alone with him again, but I need you to help me prove to other people that he's dangerous." Edward explained his plan carefully. They would go back to the office, but this time, Edward would leave Sophia in his office with the door ajar and activate the recording system he used for important video conferences. When Richard inevitably appeared to make his veiled threats, everything would be recorded. But what if he realizes he's being recorded? Sophia asked, displaying an astuteness that surprised Edward. That's why I need you to act as if you're very scared, he explained. He'll be so focused on intimidating you that he won't notice the camera. Edward paused, observing Sophia's determined expression. But if you don't want to do this, we'll find another way. Sophia shook her head firmly. I want to do it, but what if it goes wrong? What if he manages to take me away? Edward knelt in front of her, holding her small hands. That will never happen. I'll be just a few feet from you the entire time, and I've already hired private security. At the first sign of real danger, I'll stop everything. 2 hours later, they were back at the office. Edward positioned Sophia in his office exactly as they had planned, with the camera discreetly activated and pointed toward the area where Richard would likely stand. It didn't take long. As Edward had predicted, Richard appeared at the office door less than 30 minutes later with that smile Edward now recognized as purely predatory. Edward, my old friend, Richard said, entering uninvited and closing the door behind him. I see our little guest has returned. Good to see you again, Sophia. Sophia shrank behind Edward's desk, visibly trembling, but keeping her eyes fixed on Richard, as Edward had instructed. The camera perfectly captured the change in Richard's expression when he looked at the girl. His civilized mask completely fell away, revealing something cruel and hungry. Richard, Edward said with a controlled voice, I believe you and Sophia already know each other. Richard chuckled softly, approaching the desk where Sophia was hidden. Oh yes, Sophia and I are old acquaintances, aren't we, dear? We've had many interesting conversations. Sophia whimpered softly, a sound of genuine terror that made Edward clench his fists, but he maintained his composure, knowing he needed to let Richard incriminate himself completely. Conversations about what? Edward asked, feigning casual curiosity. Richard turned to him, his eyes glinting with malice. About behavior, Edward. About the consequences of telling stories to people who shouldn't meddle in affairs that don't concern them. He crouched down to Sophia's level, and Edward saw the girl tremble even more. Isn't that right, Sophia? Our conversations have always been very educational, especially the ones about what happens to girls who don't know how to keep their mouths shut. Leave her alone, Richard, Edward said, his voice carrying a thinly veiled threat. Richard slowly stood up, his smile becoming even more sinister. Or what, Edward? You'll call the police? Tell someone who believes a homeless girl over a respected businessman? He walked to the window, looking out at the city below with his hands in his pockets. You know, Edward, I've built a very solid reputation in this city. Awards for philanthropy, recognition for social work. Who do you think people will believe? Edward felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to continue. The charade. What if someone decides to investigate more deeply? Investigate what? Richard laughed. The accidents that happen to kids on the street? The ones who just disappear when they become too problematic? He looked directly at Sophia. Did you know, Edward, that many of these children run away from the city when they realize they're causing trouble for generous people who try to help them? The threat was clear and terrifying. Richard was saying he would make Sophia disappear if Edward kept interfering. But perhaps, Richard continued, approaching the desk again, we can come to an agreement. You stop meddling where you don't belong, and I can be very generous with people who cooperate. Edward saw Sophia look at him with tear-filled eyes, but he also saw something more, determination. The girl was being incredibly brave, holding her ground despite the obvious terror she felt. What kind of agreement? Edward asked, though he already knew he would never accept any proposal that put Sophia in danger. Richard smiled, thinking he had won. Simple. You forget Sophia exists, and I guarantee your stake in our company continues to be lucrative. After all, it would be a shame if our investors found out about certain financial irregularities. Edward felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Richard was threatening not just to expose alleged irregularities, but likely to fabricate false evidence to destroy his reputation. But looking at Sophia, seeing the courage of that small child, facing her greatest fear to protect other children, Edward knew his choice had been made long ago. "You know what, Richard?" he said, rising from his chair. "I don't think we have anything left to discuss." The silence that followed Edward's words was charged with electric tension. Richard stared at him for a few seconds, processing that his blackmail had been rejected, and Edward saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "Edward," Richard said in a dangerously low voice, "I hope you're sure about what you're doing. Because once you choose this path, there's no turning back." Edward positioned himself between Richard and Sophia, his body forming a protective barrier. "I am absolutely sure, and I suggest you leave my office now." Richard laughed, but it was a humorless sound laden with malice. "Very well. But remember, Edward, I know all your secrets. I know every suspicious transaction, every political favor, every shortcut you took to build this empire." He gestured to the luxurious office. "In 48 hours, you'll have none of this left." "So be it," Edward replied with a calm that surprised even himself. "Some things are more important than money." Richard's expression changed completely. The mask of civility vanished, revealing a reptilian coldness that made Sophia let out a whimper of terror from behind the desk. "And you, little Sophia," Richard said, ignoring Edward and addressing the girl directly, "do you think you'll be safe forever behind your protector? Do you think I don't know where you both live, where you go, what you do?" Sophia slowly stood up, her little legs trembling, but her voice came out surprisingly firm. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. Mr. Edward protects me." Richard took a step toward her, but Edward blocked his way immediately. "Don't come any closer." "To her." "Or what?" Richard challenged, coming so close that Edward could feel his breath. "You're going to hit me in front of the girl? What an edifying example." Edward realized Richard was trying to provoke him into doing something that could be used against him later. With superhuman effort, he kept his composure and simply said, "Marcia, call security, please." His secretary's voice came over the intercom. "Yes, Mr. Miller. They're on their way." Richard recoiled a step, but his smile became even more sinister. "Security? How adorable. But they can't protect you 24 hours a day, Edward, and they certainly can't protect a girl who likes to wander around the city." The threat was clear and specific. Richard was saying he would do something to Sophia when she wasn't protected by the security guards. "Mr. Vance?" Two voices came from behind the door. Company security had arrived. Richard adjusted his tie and regained his professional composure with unsettling speed. "Don't worry, gentlemen, I was just leaving." He looked at Edward one last time. "I'll see you tomorrow at the board meeting, partner. I have some interesting proposals to present." After Richard left, Edward rushed to Sophia, who had collapsed in the chair, trembling violently. "It's over, little one. You were incredibly brave." "He's going to do something bad to you," Sophia whispered, clinging to Edward's shirt. "I heard it in his voice. He's going to try to hurt you to hurt me." Edward hugged the girl, realizing she had picked up nuances of the threat that perhaps he himself hadn't fully grasped. Sophia had developed a keen instinct for detecting danger, a skill no child should ever need to have. "Sophia, I need to ask you something very important," he said, crouching down to her. "Level. Would you be able to recognize the Boogeyman's voice if you heard a recording?" Sophia nodded vigorously. "Of course. I'll never forget that voice." "Why?" Edward smiled for the first time in days. "Because I recorded the entire conversation we just had. We have proof now." But even as he explained this to Sophia, Edward knew the real battle was only just beginning. Richard wasn't just a predator. He was a smart predator with resources and influence. He wouldn't be easily defeated. That afternoon, Edward received 3 disturbing calls. The first was from an important client, cancelling a $1 million contract due to concerns about the company's stability. The second was from a bank, questioning some old transactions and requesting additional documentation. The third was from a journalist asking about rumors of financial irregularities at the company. "It started," Edward murmured to himself, hanging up the phone for the 3rd time. Sophia was drawing at a nearby table, but Edward knew she was paying attention to everything. When he sighed deeply, she looked up from her paper. "He's trying to hurt you the way he hurts kids," she observed with her devastating wisdom, "making people believe bad things about you." Edward nodded, impressed once again by Sophia's ability to understand complex dynamics of power and manipulation. "Exactly, but we won't let that happen." "What are we going to do?" Sophia asked, putting her crayon aside and giving Edward her full attention. Edward looked at the girl, thin, scared, but willing to fight alongside him against a monster far more powerful than both of them. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone facing a challenge. "We're going to tell the truth," he said simply, "to everyone who will listen." Sophia smiled, a small but genuine smile. "What if no one believes us?" Edward thought. For a moment, remembering all the times in his life when he had chosen the easiest, safest, most profitable path. Then he looked at Sophia and realized that some battles were worth fighting, even when the chances of victory were small. "Then, at least we'll know we did the right thing," he replied. That night, as they drove home, Edward constantly checked the rearview mirror. There were no signs of pursuit, but he knew Richard was too clever for something so obvious. The real war would be fought in the courts, in the media, and in the corridors of power. But when he looked at Sophia sleeping peacefully in the seat beside him, Edward knew he was fighting for the most important thing in his life, the chance to become the man he always should have been. The next few days became a nightmare of constant pressure. Edward woke up every morning to a new crisis created by Richard. Cancelled contracts, tax investigations, rumors planted in the press. The campaign of destruction was meticulous and relentless, executed with the precision of someone who, intimately, knew all of Edward's vulnerable points. Sophia watched everything with worried eyes, noticing how Edward grew more tense with each call, paler with each piece of bad news. On Thursday morning, she finally couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Mr. Edward," she said, pulling on his shirt sleeve as he read another devastating email on his tablet. "Maybe I really should leave. He's hurting you because of me." Edward immediately put down the tablet and knelt in front of her. "Sophia, listen closely. No matter what happens to me, you're never going back to the streets. Never." His voice was firm, but Sophia could see the weariness in his eyes. "But you're losing everything," Sophia said, tears starting to flow. "Your company, your money, and it's all my fault." "It's not your fault," Edward said vehemently. "The fault lies with the man who hurt you and is now trying to hurt me. But do you know what I've learned these past few days? All these things I'm losing, they never truly made me happy." Edward took Sophia's small hands. "Do you know when was the last time I truly smiled before I met you? I don't even remember. You brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing." Sophia hugged him tightly and Edward felt her tremble. "I'm scared he'll manage to separate us," she confessed. "He's very powerful." At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was Dr. Martinelli, his lawyer for 15 years. "Edward," the lawyer's voice sounded tense. "We need to talk urgently. Richard has called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. He's trying to remove you from the company presidency." Edward felt his stomach sink. "On what grounds?" He presented an extensive dossier alleging mismanagement, irresponsible decisions, and involvement in situations that compromise the company's reputation. Dr. Martinelli paused. Edward, he has photos of you with the girl. He's implying terrible things. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the world crumble around him. Richard was using Sophia, an innocent child, as a weapon against him. The photos show anything inappropriate? No, of course not, but he's creating a narrative, suggesting you're involved with child trafficking, that the girl is part of an illegal scheme. The lawyer's voice was filled with anger. It's disgusting, Edward, but politically effective. After hanging up, Edward stood in the middle of the room processing the new information. Richard wasn't just trying to destroy his career. He was trying to destroy his reputation in a way that would make it impossible for him to care for Sophia. What's wrong? Sophia asked, noticing his agitation. Edward forced a smile. Just more. Boring work. How about we make pancakes for breakfast? But Sophia was too smart to be fooled. He said something about me, didn't he? Some lie to hurt you? Edward sighed, realizing he couldn't shield Sophia from all the truth. He's trying to make people believe that you and I are doing something wrong together, that I brought you home for bad reasons. Sophia's eyes widened in horror. But that's a lie. You only helped me. You saved me. I know, little one, and the people who know us know it too, but Richard is very good at planting doubts in people's minds. Sophia was silent for a few minutes, thinking deeply. Finally, she looked at Edward with a determination that surprised him. Mr. Edward, what if I told everyone the truth? On television, in the newspapers. What if I showed people who the real boogeyman is? Edward felt his heart race. The idea had merit, but it was also dangerous. Sophia, that would mean you'd have to tell your story to many different people, answer difficult questions, maybe even go to court. It would be very scary. Scarier than letting him win, Sophia asked with relentless logic. Scarier than letting him hurt other kids. Edward looked at that 6-year-old girl who was willing to face cameras, journalists and lawyers to protect other children and save the man who had taken her in. Her courage was humbling and inspiring at the same time. It would have to be done the right way, he said slowly, with lawyers specializing in children, in a safe environment with full protection. Sophia nodded vigorously. I want to do it. I want everyone to know that you are good and that he is bad. That afternoon, as Edward prepared for the meeting that would likely remove him from the company he had built, Sophia made a call that would change everything. Using the kitchen phone, she called 911 and, in a firm, clear voice, said, "My name is Sophia, and I want to report the man who hurts me, and I have proof." When Edward found out what she had done, he found Sophia sitting in the living room with a different officer from Sergeant Harris, a young, attentive woman who listened to every word with professional seriousness. "Mr. Miller," Detective Davies said, standing up when he entered, "your adopted daughter—" "She's not my adopted daughter," Edward corrected automatically, but then he paused. He looked at Sophia, who was staring at him with hope in her eyes, and realized that legally, perhaps not, but in all the ways that mattered, she had become exactly that. "She's not my adopted daughter yet," he said softly, "but I would very much like her to be." Sophia smiled through her tears, and even amidst the chaos of their shattered lives, Edward felt a moment of pure joy. The war with Richard was far from over, but for the first time, Edward felt they might have a real chance to win. Detective Davies proved to be very different from Sergeant Harris. Young, attentive, and specialized in crimes against children, she listened to every word from Sophia with professional seriousness, taking detailed notes and never questioning the veracity of her accounts. "Sophia," the detective said gently, "you were very brave to call us. Now I need you to tell me everything from the beginning, in your own terms, in your own time." Edward watched Sophia take a deep breath and begin to tell her story, from her aunt's death to the abuses on the streets, from her first encounter with the Boogeyman to the discovery that he was Richard Vance. Her voice was firm, but Edward could see her small hands trembling slightly. "And are you absolutely certain that the man who hurt you is the same Richard Vance who works with Mr. Miller?" the detective asked. "I'm sure," Sophia said without hesitation, "and I have a recording of him confessing." Detective Davies turned to Edward with renewed interest. "Mr. Miller, may I see that recording?" Edward connected his phone to his tablet and played the recorded conversation from the office. As Richard's voice filled the room, making veiled threats and sinister references to his past with Sophia, the detective's expression grew increasingly grim. "This recording is extremely incriminating," she said when it finished. "But we'll need more evidence for a solid case. Mr. Vance is a respected public figure. The defense will question the authenticity of the recording and the credibility of the witness." Edward felt a pang of discouragement, but Sophia leaned forward in her chair. "I told Mr. Edward that he hurt other kids too, Julia who disappeared, and he said he had friends who would tell him where I was." Detective Davies wrote everything down carefully. "Sophia, could you describe these other places where he found you, the people who might have seen you with him?" For 2 hours, Sophia answered questions with impressive precision. She described specific locations, times, people who might have witnessed the encounters. Edward was impressed by the clarity of her memory. The trauma had etched every detail into her mind. "We'll open a formal investigation," the detective finally said. "But Mr. Miller, I need to warn you, this will become public. The press will be interested, especially considering Mr. Vance's position. You need to be prepared for intense scrutiny." As if on cue, Edward's phone rang at that exact moment. It was Dr. Martinelli. "Edward, where are you?" "The board meeting started an hour ago. Richard is presenting arguments for your removal and it's not going well." Edward looked at Sophia, who watched him with confident eyes, and at Detective Davies, who awaited his decision on how to proceed with the investigation. "Dr. Martinelli, tell the board I'll be there in half an hour and that I'm bringing evidence that will completely change the context of this meeting." After hanging up, Edward knelt in front of Sophia. "Little one, the time has come for us to face this together. Are you ready?" Sophia nodded, but Edward could see the fear in her eyes. "Will there be many important people there?" "Yes, but remember, you're not alone anymore. I'll be by your side. Detective Davies will be with us, and now everyone will know the truth." An hour later, Edward entered the company's boardroom, accompanied by Sophia, Detective Davies, and Dr. Martinelli. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Richard was in the middle of a presentation, pointing to charts that supposedly showed Edward's mismanagement. When he saw Sophia enter, his face visibly blanched, but he quickly regained his composure. "Edward," said the chairman of the board, Dr. Thompson, "we were discussing serious allegations about your recent decisions, and—" "I know exactly what you were discussing," Edward interrupted, "and I'm here to present evidence that Mr. Vance's allegations are part of a campaign of blackmail and intimidation." Richard laughed nervously. "Edward, you're clearly under stress. Perhaps we should reschedule this for another time when you're more balanced." "On the contrary," said Detective Davies, showing her identification, "I believe this is the perfect time. Richard Vance, you are under investigation for assault against minors and extortion." The chaos that ensued was indescribable. Board members rose from their chairs, voices overlapped in confused questions, and Richard stood up so abruptly that he knocked over his chair. "This is absurd!" Richard shouted. "A charade orchestrated by a desperate man who's losing control of his own company." Sophia, who had remained quiet until then, stepped forward a few paces. Her small voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You're the boogeyman who hurt me every night." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia looked directly at Richard, fearless for the first time since she had met him. "You hit me and said no one would believe me because I'm just a street kid. But Mr. Edward believed me, and now everyone will know who you really are." Richard tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced and desperate. "You're going to believe a traumatized child against this?" Edward interrupted, playing the recording at high volume. Richard's voice filled the boardroom. Arrogant, threatening, implicitly admitting his relationship with Sophia and making clear references to other crimes. Every word was a condemnation, and Edward watched Richard's face crumble as his own voice betrayed him. When the recording ended, Dr. Thompson looked at Richard with an expression of absolute disgust. "Richard, you are fired, effective immediately. Security, please escort Mr. Vance out of the building." But Richard didn't go quietly. As he was being led away, he yelled at Sophia, "You'll regret this, you little—" He couldn't finish the sentence because Edward stepped between them, completely blocking Richard's view of Sophia. "You'll never get near her again," Edward said, with deadly calm. "Never again." When Richard was finally removed, Sophia ran to Edward and threw herself into his arms. "Is it over?" she asked in a small voice. Edward hugged her tightly, feeling his own tears stream down his face. "The worst is over, little one. Now it's just a matter of time until justice does its job." Dr. Thompson approached them, his voice full of remorse. "Edward, on behalf of the entire board, I apologize. If we had known—" "You couldn't have known," Edward replied. Richard was very good at keeping his two faces separate. But even in the moment of victory, Edward knew there were still challenges ahead. The investigation would be long, the legal battle arduous, and his company had suffered damage that would take time to repair. Looking at Sophia in his arms, however, Edward realized he had gained something infinitely more valuable than any company. He had found his true family and rediscovered his humanity. The war hadn't ended, but the first major battle was won. 3. Weeks after the confrontation at the office, Edward woke up to a sound that had become his favorite melody. Sophia's laughter echoing through the house. She was in the kitchen, trying to make pancakes with the help of Maria, the cook Edward had hired specifically to take care of the girls' meals. "Mr. Edward!" Sophia called out when she saw him coming down the stairs. "I made a round pancake. Look." She proudly held up a nearly perfect pancake, her face lit up with a joy Edward had never imagined possible on that first cold night when he found her trembling on the sidewalk. "It's beautiful," Edward said, sitting at the kitchen island. That had become the true heart of his home, almost as beautiful as the chef. Sophia blushed with pleasure, serving him a generous portion. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal activities, interviews with social workers, and preparations for the adoption process, but they had also been filled with small, magical moments like that. "Maria taught me how to make coffee too," Sophia said, carefully pouring the steaming liquid into Edward's cup. "She said every young lady needs to know how to take care of the people she loves." Edward felt his chest tighten with emotion. Sophia had found not just a father, but an entire family. Maria, with her 60 years of maternal experience, had instantly fallen in love with the girl and become a perfect surrogate grandmother. "Mr. Miller," Maria said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Detective Davies called early. She said she had important news about the case." Edward's stomach tightened slightly. In recent days, the investigation into Richard had intensified dramatically. The police had found 3 other children who confirmed the abuses and evidence of a much larger scheme than anyone had imagined. "Good news?" Sophia asked, noticing the tension in Maria's voice. "We'll only know when we talk to her," Edward said softly. "But no matter what it is, we face it together, remember?" Sophia nodded vigorously, But Edward could see a shadow of worry in her eyes. Even with all the security she had found, there were still deep scars that would take time to heal completely. An hour later, they were at the police precinct, sitting in Detective Davies' office. The detective was smiling, a good sign. "I have several updates," she began. "First, Richard Vance has been formally indicted on multiple counts of child abuse, based on Sophia's testimony and the other children's accounts, plus the evidence we collected. It's practically certain he will be sentenced to a significant term." Sophia clutched Edward's hand, and he felt her relax slightly. "He won't be able to hurt children anymore?" "Never again," Detective Davies confirmed. "But there's more. During the investigation, we discovered that Richard had connections to a wider network. Several other individuals have been arrested, including some who provided information about vulnerable children." Edward felt a chill down his spine as he realized the extent of what Sophia had faced alone. "How many people?" 12 arrests so far, and the investigation is ongoing. Detective Davies turned to Sophia. "Your courage in speaking the truth saved many other children, Sophia. You are a hero." Sophia blushed, hiding her face in Edward's shoulder. "I just wanted him to stop hurting people." "And you did," Edward said, kissing the top of her head. "You did it in a way that changed everything." Detective Davies smiled and picked up a different folder. "Now about the other important matter, the adoption process." Edward felt his heart quicken. In recent weeks, he had filed the paperwork to officially adopt Sophia, but the process was complex and there were many variables. "Based on our interviews, psychological evaluations, and home visits, I'm recommending the adoption be approved," Detective Davies said. "Sophia has clearly found not just a home, but a family that loves her deeply." Sophia jumped out of the chair. "Does that mean I can really be your daughter?" "It means exactly that," Edward said, tears streaming freely down his face. "If you want to, of course." "I want to. I really do," Sophia cried, throwing herself into his arms. 2 weeks later in court, Edward officially became a father. Sophia, wearing a blue dress she had chosen herself, stood beside him before the judge, holding his hand tightly. "Edward Miller," the judge said solemnly, "do you accept all the responsibilities of being Sophia's father, promising to care for her, protect her, and love her for the rest of your life?" "I do," Edward said, his voice laden with emotion. "And you, Sophia," the judge turned to her, "do you accept Edward as your father forever?" "I do," Sophia said loud and clear, then whispered to Edward, "Can I call you Daddy now?" Edward couldn't answer through his tears, only nodded and hugged her tightly. After the ceremony, they left the courthouse under a light rain, but Sophia insisted on walking outside. "The rain doesn't scare me anymore," she explained. "Nothing scares me anymore when you're with me." At the company, things had also stabilized. With Richard gone and contracts gradually being restored, Edward had made an important decision. He transferred much of his executive responsibilities to trusted colleagues, retaining only strategic control. He wanted to have time to be the father Sophia deserved. "Daddy," Sophia said in the car on the way home, using the new word with obvious pleasure, "can I ask you something?" "Anything, Princess." "Do you regret finding me that night?" "You lost a lot of things because of me." Edward stopped the car at the garage entrance and turned to look at her fully. "Sophia, listen closely. You didn't make me lose anything. You made me find everything that truly matters. Before I met you, I had money, but I had no life. I had success, but I had no love. I had a house, but I had no home." He took her small hands. "You taught me that true wealth isn't in the bank, but in the hearts of the people we love. You transformed an empty man into a proud father." Sophia smiled through her tears. "And you transformed a scared girl into a loved daughter." That night, Edward tucked Sophia into her bed, no longer the guest room, but a room decorated specially for her, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and storybooks on the shelves. "Daddy," she said sleepily, "do you think the Boogeyman still exists somewhere?" Edward thought carefully before answering. "Unfortunately, there are bad people in the world, little one. But do you know what else exists? Good people willing to fight them. And now you know there will always be someone to protect you. And other children too?" "Especially other children," Edward confirmed, remembering the foundation he had begun. To plan to help vulnerable children. Sophia slept peacefully, and Edward remained for a few minutes watching her. The girl he had found trembling with cold and fear now slept safe, loved, and protected. But more than that, she had become the light that illuminated his own darkness. As he left the room, Edward looked one last time at his daughter and whispered, "Thank you for saving me, little one. Thank you for teaching me what it means to be truly rich." 6 months later, Edward was in his garden watching Sophia play with 3 other children who had arrived that morning. They were the first temporary residents of the Sophia Foundation, the organization he had created to shelter and protect vulnerable children. The large house had been transformed, where once only the lonely footsteps of a bitter man echoed. Now resonated laughter, lively conversations, and the joyful noise of a growing family. Maria had multiplied into 3 caring staff members, and Edward had hired psychologists, social workers, and teachers to care for every aspect of the children's development. "Daddy!" Sophia ran up to him, her hair flying in the wind. She had visibly grown in recent months, not just physically, but in confidence, joy, and security. "Julia's here. Remember I told you about her? The girl the Boogeyman said had disappeared." Edward smiled, remembering the investigations that had led to Julia's rescue from a terrible situation. "Of course I remember. How is she adapting?" "She still has nightmares," Sophia said with the wisdom of someone who deeply understood trauma. "But I told her that here, nightmares can't hurt us, and that you never let any Boogeyman in." Edward knelt to Sophia's height, still impressed by how she had become a natural mentor for other traumatized children. "And what else did you tell her?" "That it hurts a lot at first, but then we learn to be happy again," Sophia said, hugging Edward's neck. "That family isn't just who you're born with, but who chooses to stay together." At that moment, Dr. Martinelli approached them, carrying a folder. "Edward, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have the final results of the trial." Edward stood up, feeling Sophia automatically cling to his hand. Even after so many months, she still tensed up when adults talked about serious matters. "Richard Vance has been sentenced to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole," Dr. Martinelli announced, "and all his accomplices also received significant sentences." Sophia looked at Edward with wide eyes. "Is 25 years a long time?" "It's enough time for you to grow up, graduate, maybe even have your own children," Edward explained softly. "Enough time to be sure he'll never hurt anyone again." Sophia nodded, but instead of relief, Edward saw a thoughtful expression on her face. "Daddy, do you think he'll learn to be a better person in prison?" The question surprised Edward. After everything she had been through, Sophia could still find compassion in her heart, still hope that even her tormentors could become better people. "I don't know, little one," he said honestly, "but I know that you became a better person despite everything he did. And that's much more important." Dr. Martinelli smiled, clearly touched by the conversation. "Edward, there's one more thing. The city has officially recognized the Sophia Foundation as a public charity. You'll receive government support to expand the program." "Does that mean we can help more children?" Sophia asked, her eyes shining with hope. "Many more," Edward confirmed, feeling his chest swell with pride for his extraordinary daughter. That night, after all the children had gone to sleep, Edward found himself alone in his office for the first time in months. He looked at the photos that now decorated his desk. Sophia on adoption day, the foundation children playing in the garden, he and Sophia cutting the cake on her first birthday at home. He picked up a special photo frame, a picture of Sophia sleeping peacefully on her first night in the house, still wearing his oversized coat. Beneath the photo she had written in her childlike handwriting, "To the daddy who taught me that love is stronger than fear." Edward smiled, remembering the man he was just a year ago. Cold, lonely, obsessed only with financial success. That man had died the night he found a little girl trembling on the sidewalk, and in his place, someone Edward never knew he could be had been born. "Daddy!" A small voice came from the door. Sophia was there, barefoot and in her pajamas, holding her teddy bear. "What is it, princess? Nightmare?" "No," she said, walking up to him. "I just wanted to say good night for real." Edward picked her up and Sophia snuggled against his chest. "Daddy, can I tell you a secret?" "Always. Sometimes I still remember that night when you found me, and I keep thinking, what if you had just driven by? What if you hadn't stopped to help me?" Edward felt his heart clench, imagining that terrible possibility. "But I did stop. And do you know why?" Sophia shook her head, curious. "Because you reminded me of who I truly was inside. You reminded me that there are things more important than money, more valuable than success, more powerful than fear." Sophia smiled. "And you reminded me that there are good adults in the world, that there are people willing to fight for others, even when it costs a lot." Edward hugged her tighter, realizing that they had both saved each other on that cold night. She had saved him from loneliness and emptiness, and he had saved her from danger and abandonment. "Daddy," Sophia said sleepily, "tomorrow can we visit the new school you want to build for the Foundation's children?" "Of course we can," Edward replied, kissing the top of her head. "We'll build the most beautiful and safest school that ever existed, with a big library, huge, and a playground, the best in the city." Sophia smiled, closing her eyes. "It'll be perfect. The children will be so happy." Edward carried the sleeping Sophia back to her room, tucked her into bed, and whispered, "Sleep well, my love. Tomorrow we'll keep making the world a little better." As he left the room, Edward looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere, there were other children needing help, other adults needing to rediscover their humanity. And for the first time in his life, Edward knew exactly what his purpose was: to use his wealth, his influence, and his love to build bridges between broken hearts. The girl he had found trembling with cold on a sidewalk had become his most important teacher, teaching him that true wealth is not measured in bank figures, but in the depth of the relationships we build and the positive impact we make on the lives of others. Edward Miller had been a successful millionaire, but only now, at 41, had he become truly rich. Rich in love, rich in purpose, rich in the certainty that each day offered a new opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. And it had all begun with a courageous child who transformed Mr. Edward into daddy and solitude into family, proving that the greatest miracles happen when we open our hearts to those who most need our protection and love. In the quiet of his home filled with life, Edward smiled, knowing that he had found the most precious treasure of all, a family built not by blood ties, but by the much stronger bonds of unconditional love and the conscious choice to care for one another.